Hey guys, tonight's journey is called How the Poor Survived Winter in the Middle Ages. On long, freezing nights, when icy winds moved through narrow stone streets and snow settled quietly on wooden rooftops, how did the poorest people survive? In a world without central heating, without electric blankets, and without modern shelters, what happened when winter arrived? Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Most of you watching aren't subscribed yet, and it truly helps this small channel grow, and I'm always curious. As you're listening tonight, wrapped in your own warm space, which city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, pull your blanket a little closer, and let's step softly into a medieval winter night. Take a slow breath in, and let it drift out gently. Tonight we step into a different kind of medieval story. Not into castles filled with firelight and feasts, but into narrow alleys, stone streets, and quiet corners of towns where the cold settled first. Winter in the Middle Ages was not romantic. It was not soft falling snow outside a warm window. It was sharp wind cutting through wool. It was frost creeping across wooden doors. It was hunger growing quietly as daylight faded earlier each afternoon. And for the poor, winter was the most dangerous season of all. When the air began to change, in late autumn, people could feel it coming. The mornings grew quieter. Breath became visible in the early light. Fields hardened under thin sheets of frost. For wealthy households, this meant preparation. Firewood was already stacked in neat piles. Salted meat hung from rafters. Thick blankets were aired and folded. But for the poor, day labourers, widows, wandering workers, beggars, preparation was not always possible. Many did not own land. Many worked for daily wages. If work stopped, income stopped, and winter often stopped everything. The problem with work. In summer and autumn, even the poorest villagers could find some labour. Harvesting grain, repairing fences, carrying goods to market, working in fields from dawn until dusk. But winter changed the rhythm of work. Frozen ground meant no planting. Short days meant fewer hours. Snow-covered roads meant less trade. Towns slowed down. Villages grew still. And when work disappeared, so did coins. Without coins, there was no bread, no ale, no place by someone else's fire. For the poor, survival depended on small daily exchanges, and winter made those exchanges fragile. Clothing, the first line of defence. Imagine standing outside in January wind, no insulated jacket, no thermal layers. Medieval clothing was made mostly of wool. Wool was valuable because it trapped warmth even when damp. But good wool was expensive. The poor often wore rough, thin garments, patched many times over. A single cloak might serve for years. It might be shared between family members. Shoes were simple leather, often worn thin at the soles. Straw could be stuffed inside for insulation, but straw shifted and flattened quickly. Feet grew numb first, then fingers. Cold did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, until it settled deep in the bones. The role of fire meant life, but fire required fuel, and fuel required money, or land. Wealthier households stored large amounts of firewood before winter. The poor might gather fallen branches from forests, but forests were often owned by nobles. Taking wood without permission could lead to punishment. Some towns allowed limited gathering of dead wood, but supply never met demand. A small fire might burn only briefly each night. Families would sit close together, knees nearly touching the flames. When the fire died, the cold returned quickly. Stone walls did not hold warmth. Wooden huts let wind slip through cracks. Winter nights were long, very long. Sleeping in the cold beds were not what we imagine today. Many poor households had simple straw mattresses laid on wooden frames, or directly on the floor. Straw provided some insulation, but it needed replacing often. It absorbed moisture. It attracted insects. Blankets were layered wool, if available. Sometimes entire families shared one sleeping space, not out of affection, but for warmth. Body heat was precious. Children slept between adults, everyone wrapped tightly in whatever cloth they owned. If someone rose during the night, the loss of warmth was felt immediately, and for those without homes, they sought shelter wherever possible. The church as refuge. In many medieval towns, the church played a role in winter survival. Monasteries and churches sometimes distributed bread or thin soup. Alms were given to the poor, especially during harsh seasons. Charity was considered a Christian duty, but charity was limited. Resources were not endless. During particularly brutal winters, even monasteries struggled. Some churches allowed the poor to sleep inside porches or sheltered areas. Stone floors were cold, but walls blocked the wind, and sometimes that was enough. Urban versus rural. Winter in a village felt different from winter in a city. In rural areas, people might know one another closely. Neighbours could help neighbours, sharing small supplies, watching each other's children. In cities, crowds were larger, but anonymity was greater. Urban poor might sleep beneath stairways, under market stalls, beside workshop walls. The smell of smoke and damp wool filled narrow streets. Some towns had informal shelters, barns or storage houses where people gathered. But these spaces were cramped. Air grew thick. Illness spread easily in winter. Cold weakened the body, and weakened bodies caught sickness quickly. Hunger and winter cold alone was dangerous. Cold with hunger was worse. By late winter, February and March, stored food supplies often ran low. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap. Bread grew smaller, ale thinner, meals reduced to simple porridge. For the poor, hunger sharpened the edge of winter. Without enough calories, the body cannot generate heat effectively. Shivering became constant, fatigue heavy. Children were especially vulnerable, and yet life continued. People endured. Because endurance was not heroic in medieval times, it was simply necessary. The sound of winter nights. Imagine walking through a medieval town at midnight in January. Wind brushing against stone walls, a shutter creaking somewhere above, distant coughing from inside a hut, a small fire crackling behind a wooden door, snow-absorbing sound, the world quieter than usual. In that quiet, the poor listened carefully, for danger, for opportunity, for morning, because morning meant light, and light meant another day survived. Not all winters were equal. Some winters were mild, others were devastating. There were years when rivers froze solid, years when snow fell heavily for weeks, and during the colder centuries, especially during what historians call the Little Ice Age, winters could be especially harsh. Crop failures compounded the struggle. If autumn harvest had been weak, winter became catastrophic. The poor had no buffer, no savings, no stored abundance, only daily survival. Small acts of resilience. And yet, within hardship, small strategies emerged. Layering clothing carefully, sleeping against interior walls rather than outer ones, stuffing cracks in doors with rags, burning peat instead of wood when available, sharing space with animals whose body heat warmed small cottages. Yes, in rural homes, animals were sometimes kept indoors during severe cold, not from affection, from necessity. A goat or pig nearby could raise the room's temperature slightly. In winter, every small advantage mattered. The quiet strength of endurance. We often imagine medieval poverty as constant despair, but daily life contained rhythm. Even in winter, morning chores, simple meals, repairing clothing, telling stories by the fire when there was a fire. Community remained important. People checked on one another. Sometimes sharing a loaf of bread meant the difference between weakness and survival. Winter did not remove humanity. It tested it. The wind has grown colder now. Snow has begun to gather along the edges of stone streets, settling into corners where sunlight rarely reaches. In part 1, we stood outside in the winter air. Now, we step closer, closer to the walls, closer to the doorways, closer to the places where the poorest people tried to sleep. Because surviving winter was not only about clothing or food, it was about shelter, and shelter, in the medieval world, was never guaranteed. The smallest homes. For the rural poor, home often meant a single-room cottage. The walls were made of wattle and daub, woven wooden strips covered with mud and straw. The roof was thatched, beautiful from a distance. But in winter, thatch could let in draughts. There were no glass windows in most poor homes. Instead, wooden shutters closed at night. Even when shut tightly, wind found its way through small cracks. Inside, the space was simple. A central hearth, a wooden table, perhaps a stool, a chest for clothing, and in one corner, straw bedding. There were no separate bedrooms. Privacy was rare. The entire family shared one heated space, and heated may be too generous a word. The hearth warmed only the area closest to it. A few steps away, the cold returned. The hearth as the heart of survival. The fire burned in the centre of the room. Smoke rose upward, if the roof allowed it to escape. Some cottages had small holes or primitive chimneys. Others simply let smoke drift upward into the thatch before filtering out. In winter, families often kept the fire small to conserve fuel. But small fires meant limited warmth. When night came, people arranged their bedding as close to the hearth as possible. Straw mattresses were dragged nearer. Children were placed between adults. Cloaks doubled as blankets. If fuel ran low, the fire might be reduced to glowing embers overnight. The hope was that by morning a spark remained. Relighting a fire from nothing was difficult. Keeping a single coal alive through the night was an act of quiet strategy. When a cottage was not enough. But not everyone had even a single-room cottage. Some people owned no property at all. Seasonal workers, travellers, the elderly without family. They relied on temporary arrangements. A space in someone else's home. A corner of a stable. A barn loft filled with hay. Hay was warm, at least at first. It trapped body heat better than bare ground. But barns were not insulated. Wind slipped through wooden slats. Snow drifted in through gaps. Still, compared to the open street, a barn was mercy. Sleeping beside animals. In rural villages, animals were valuable. Cows, goats, pigs. They represented survival. During severe cold, animals were sometimes brought indoors, not only to protect them, but to share warmth. A cow's body generates significant heat. In a small space, that warmth made a difference. The air may have been thick with the scent of hay and livestock, but warmth outweighed discomfort. For the poorest, comfort was secondary. Warmth meant life. Urban night cities were harsher in different ways. Stone buildings replaced thatch. Streets were narrower. The wind funneled between walls like a corridor of ice. The urban poor often rented tiny rooms in crowded buildings. Several families might share one structure. Rooms were dark. Ventilation was poor. Privacy was non-existent. But stone buildings blocked wind more effectively than wooden huts. For those who could afford even a small rented space, it was better than the street. And for those who could not. They searched for hidden shelter, doorways and market stalls. At night, medieval marketplaces fell silent. Wooden stalls stood empty. Canvas coverings flapped gently in the wind. Some poor individuals slept beneath these stalls. They tucked themselves against walls for protection, wrapping cloaks tightly, pulling straw or rags beneath them for insulation. Stone ground drew heat away from the body quickly. Without something beneath you, the cold seeped upward relentlessly. Some chose doorways, recessed entrances that blocked wind from two sides. It was not safe, but it was slightly warmer than open streets. the danger of exposure. Cold works slowly. First, fingers lose feeling, then toes. Breath becomes shallow, thought becomes foggy. The medieval poor did not understand hypothermia in modern medical terms, but they understood its signs. If someone stopped shivering, it was dangerous. If speech slowed, if movement became sluggish, alarm grew. Communities watched carefully in winter, especially for the elderly. An old widow living alone could be lost to cold quietly without notice. Sometimes neighbours checked in, sometimes they did not. Hospitals and almshouses. Some towns had early forms of charity housing. Hospitals in medieval times were not like modern medical centres. They were closer to shelters, run often by religious orders. These institutions offered beds to the sick and the poor, simple straw pallets in large shared halls, a thin blanket, perhaps a bowl of broth. It was not luxury, but it was indoors. During severe winters, these places filled quickly. Resources stretched thin. Not everyone was admitted. But for those inside, the difference was life-saving. The importance of walls. Stone walls blocked wind. Wood blocked some wind. But wind always searched for weakness. People learned to position themselves strategically, against interior walls, away from doors, curled tightly to preserve heat. Sleeping flat on your back exposed more surface area. Curling into a tighter shape helped conserve warmth. Even posture became survival knowledge, the shared body. Heat families often slept pressed together. It was not sentimental, it was practical. 3 bodies under one blanket create more warmth than one alone. Children were placed in the middle. Their small bodies needed protection. Parents formed the outer layer, absorbing the worst of the cold. This closeness created a rhythm of breathing, a shared warmth, a quiet sense of survival through unity. Winter demanded togetherness. When there was no shelter, there were times when shelter could not be found. Travellers caught between towns, beggar communities moving from place to place. In such cases, forests offered some protection. Trees blocked wind better than open fields. People dug shallow depressions in snow to reduce exposure, covering themselves with branches. It was primitive, desperate, but sometimes effective for a single night. The goal was always the same: last until morning. The longest hours. The hardest part of winter was not the coldest moment. It was the duration. Night could last 14 or 15 hours. Darkness pressed heavily against small rooms. Time moved slowly. Without light, activity ceased. People slept longer not by choice, but because there was nothing else to do. And sleep conserved energy. Energy conserved meant heat preserved. Winter shaped behaviour. It forced stillness. Quiet resilience. Despite the harshness, winter did not erase humanity. People still spoke softly before sleep. Mothers hummed to children, fathers checked door latches twice. Neighbours shared small bundles of wood when possible. And even in cities, small acts of kindness appeared. A merchant allowing someone to sleep inside his shop doorway. A baker handing out leftover crusts. These gestures were not guaranteed, but they existed. Because medieval communities understood something deeply. Anyone could become poor. Anyone could face winter unprepared. Take a slow breath in, and imagine the feeling of cold air against your face. Not the sharp shock of stepping outside for a moment, but the kind of cold that lingers, the kind that follows you indoors, that settles into fabric, that waits in the corners of rooms long after the fire fades. In the medieval world, clothing was not about fashion for the poor. It was survival. And in winter, survival began with layers, the importance of wool. If there was one fabric that stood between life and death in medieval winter, it was wool. Wool came from sheep, and sheep were common across Europe. But common did not mean cheap. Good wool required land, animals, time, and labour. The wealthy could afford thick, well-woven wool cloaks lined with fur. The poor made do with rougher, thinner versions. Still, even coarse wool had an advantage. It trapped air, and trapped air meant insulation. Even when slightly damp, wool retained some warmth, unlike linen, which lost heat quickly when wet. For many poor families, a single wool cloak served multiple purposes. It was a coat by day, a blanket by night, a shield against wind, a barrier between body and straw bedding. A cloak was not just clothing, it was protection. Layering without modern layers. Today we might wear thermal undergarments, insulated jackets, gloves designed for extreme cold. In the Middle Ages, layering was simpler. A basic shirt, often linen, sat against the skin. Over it, a wool tunic. Over that, perhaps another heavier garment, and finally a cloak tied at the shoulder or neck. But not everyone owned multiple layers. Some wore the same thin tunic year-round. Patches covered worn elbows, stitches reinforced seams again and again. Clothing was expensive to replace. It was repaired until repair was no longer possible, and in winter, every small tear mattered. A hole allowed wind inside, and wind stole warmth faster than anything else. The roll of fur was a luxury, but even the poor sometimes had access to small pieces. Rabbit fur was more affordable than fox or ermine. A strip of fur sewn inside a hood could protect ears from frost. Even a small fur lining around the neck prevented heat from escaping upward. Heat rises. Medieval people may not have understood the physics, but they understood the feeling. Cover the head. Stay warmer. Expose the head. Lose heat quickly. Simple observation became quiet knowledge passed through generations. Covering the head hoods were common. Simple woolen hoods that covered head and shoulders. In cities, caps made from felted wool were popular. At night, many slept with head coverings still on. It may have looked unusual to us, but in an unheated room, removing your hood meant surrendering warmth. Children were often wrapped fully, head included, when sleeping. Only the face visible, breath rising softly in the cold air. Hands and feet, the first to freeze. Fingers and toes suffered most. Gloves were not common among the poor. Mittens were easier to make than gloves, and sometimes used when possible, for insulation. Straw worked briefly. It for insulation. Straw worked briefly. It created a barrier between leather sole and frozen ground, but straw flattened with movement. It needed replacing often. Still, it was something. And in winter, something was always better than nothing. The condition of shoes were valuable, made of leather, stitched carefully by hand. But leather wore down quickly, especially in wet snow. Water seeped through seams. Once wet, leather stiffened in cold temperatures, cracked, hardened. For the poorest, walking barefoot was not unheard of in warmer months. But in winter, bare skin against frozen ground was dangerous. Even worn shoes were precious. They were dried carefully near the hearth when possible, though too close to fire and they might shrink or crack further. Balancing dryness and preservation required patience. Reusing and recycling clothing. Clothing rarely went to waste. When a tunic became too worn to wear, it became patches. When patches became too thin, they became stuffing. Rags stuffed into sleeves added thickness. Scraps layered inside cloaks increased insulation. Old blankets were cut into pieces and redistributed among family members. Nothing was discarded casually. Fabric was time. Time was labour. Labour was survival. Sleeping garments. Most poor families did not own separate night clothes. They slept in what they wore during the day. Removing layers meant losing warmth. And in a freezing room, modesty mattered less than heat. Cloaks remained on. Hoods stayed up. Sometimes shoes were kept beside the bedding, ready for quick movement if needed. Because winter nights were unpredictable. Fires sometimes died unexpectedly. Roofs sometimes leaked melting snow. Preparedness was quiet wisdom. The smell of winter clothing. Imagine the scent of wool dampened by snow, the faint smoke absorbed from hearth fires, the earthiness of straw. Winter clothing carried the smell of survival. It was not unpleasant to medieval senses. It was familiar, comforting even. A cloak that smelled of smoke meant it had been near warmth. A tunic stiff with frost meant the wearer had endured the cold and returned. Scents told stories. Improvised insulation beyond clothing. Insulation extended to the body itself. The poor ate when they could, not only to satisfy hunger, but to create warmth. Food fuels heat. A full stomach helped the body fight cold. Fat was valuable in winter for this reason. Animal fat, when available, provided calories that burned slowly. Without sufficient food, even thick wool felt insufficient. Thin bodies struggled to retain heat. Winter revealed physical vulnerability quickly. Children and the elderly children often wore oversized garments, handed down from older siblings. Layers bunched awkwardly around small frames, but looseness allowed space for air, and air trapped meant warmth. The elderly, however, struggled most. Aging bodies generate less heat. Arthritic hands stiffened in cold. Thin skin offered little insulation. Communities that cared for their elderly increased survival chances. Those without family faced winter with greater risk. When clothing failed. There were winters when clothing was simply not enough. When wind cut through wool as if it were thin paper. When snow soaked cloaks beyond recovery. When frozen garments had to be beaten gently in the morning to loosen stiffness. These moments were not dramatic. They were quiet tests, daily negotiations with discomfort, endurance measured in hours. The psychological layer clothing provided more than warmth. It provided reassurance. A thick cloak wrapped tightly around the body created a feeling of protection, even if imperfect, even if patched. The ritual of layering before stepping into cold built confidence. Pulling a hood up, tightening a belt, adjusting sleeves. These small actions signaled readiness. Winter required preparation, even if preparation was minimal. Take a slow breath in and imagine the soft glow of a dying fire. The wind presses gently against the walls. Snow rests quietly outside. Inside, winter is not only cold, it is hungry. Because warmth did not come from clothing alone. It came from food, and for the poor in the Middle Ages, winter meals were simple, careful, and sometimes uncertain. The meaning of a full-stomach food in winter was more than comfort. It was fuel. The human body creates heat by burning calories. Even without scientific language, medieval people understood this through experience. A warm bowl of porridge could quiet shivering. A piece of bread could restore strength. Without food, the cold felt sharper, more invasive. Hunger weakened the body's ability to resist frost, and winter was long, very long. Preparing for the cold months. Those who could afford it prepared during autumn. Grain was harvested, vegetables pulled from the earth, meat salted or smoked. But the poor rarely had large stores. Many worked on land they did not own. Payment often came in small portions, some grain, a little ale, occasional scraps of meat. Savings were rare, so when winter arrived, supplies were already modest, and modest supplies disappear quickly. Bread, the foundation. Bread was the centre of the medieval diet. For the wealthy, white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. For the poor, darker bread made from rye, barley, or mixed grains. This bread was dense, heavy, sometimes coarse in texture. It filled the stomach, and that was what mattered most. During winter, bread rations sometimes grew smaller. Grain stores had to last until spring. By late winter, February and March, flour quality often declined, sometimes ground from older, less perfect grain, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch supply. But even imperfect bread meant life. Pottage, the quiet companion. Alongside bread, there was pottage, a simple stew. Ingredients varied based on what was available. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips. Beans and peas were common winter staples. They stored well when dried. Added to boiling water, they created thick, filling meals. Sometimes a small piece of salted pork flavoured the pot. But meat was not daily food for the poor. It was occasional. Flavour often came from herbs grown in small kitchen gardens during warmer months and dried for winter use. Parsley, thyme, sage, simple flavours, but deeply comforting, the long decline of supplies. At the beginning of winter, meals might feel manageable. By midwinter, portions became careful. By late winter, anxiety grew. This period was sometimes called the lean season. Root vegetables softened in storage. Grain sacks grew lighter. Salted meat, if any remained, was rationed carefully. Hunger did not arrive suddenly. It crept forward slowly. A slightly smaller bowl, a skipped second serving, an evening with only bread and water. Each small reduction felt manageable, until the body began to weaken. Ale and warmth ale was not only a drink, it was nourishment. Medieval ale was weaker than modern versions. It provided calories. It was safer than water in many towns. Warm ale before sleep could create a sense of comfort. Children drank diluted versions. It was part of daily life. In winter, ale added small warmth, not from heat alone, but from energy. But when grain supplies ran low, ale production decreased. Another quiet loss in the rhythm of daily survival. When hunger met cold. Cold consumes energy. Hunger removes it. Together they create vulnerability. Thin bodies shiver more intensely. Children grow quiet. The elderly tire quickly. Medieval communities recognized visible weakness. They saw when someone was struggling. Sometimes neighbours shared what little they had. A crust of bread passed quietly through a doorway. A bowl of thin broth left near a neighbour's hearth. These acts were not grand gestures. They were small mercies. Charity and almsgiving winter increased acts of charity. Churches distributed alms when possible. Bread for the poor, occasionally dried fish. Religious teachings emphasized care for the needy. But churches had limited stores too, and during particularly harsh winters, demand exceeded supply. Lines formed quietly in courtyards. People waited patiently, grateful for whatever was given. Even a small portion mattered, foraging in winter. In summer and autumn, foraging supplemented diets, berries, nuts, wild greens. But winter offered little. Occasionally hardy plants like nettles could be gathered, if the ground was not frozen solid. Some gathered firewood and discovered edible roots beneath snow. But opportunities were limited. Winter stripped the landscape bare, leaving little beyond what had been stored. The emotional weight of food carried meaning beyond survival. A shared meal strengthened bonds. Even simple bread broken between family members created warmth beyond physical heat. Parents sometimes reduced their own portions so children could eat more. A quiet sacrifice repeated in countless homes. No announcement, no recognition, just instinct. Because winter demanded protection of the young first. The sound of cooking. Imagine a small pot hanging above a fire, water gently bubbling, the soft scent of onions filling the room. Outside, wind whispers against the thatch. Inside, the promise of warmth builds slowly. Meals were not elaborate, but the act of cooking itself brought reassurance. It meant there was still something left, still something to share. The last weeks of winter. The hardest period often came just before spring, when stores were nearly empty, when snow lingered longer than hoped, when daylight increased but warmth did not yet follow. This waiting period tested patience deeply, but spring always came, eventually. Green shoots emerged, work resumed, and with work income slowly returned. Winter ended not with celebration, but with quiet relief. The fire is low tonight. Outside the wind has softened, but the cold remains. In winter, survival was not only about warmth and food, it was about health. Because when cold lingered for weeks and hunger stretched thin, the body grew fragile, and a fragile body welcomes illness quietly. The cold and the human body. Medieval people did not understand germs. They did not know about bacteria or viruses, but they understood patterns. They noticed that coughs spread faster in winter, that fevers appeared more often, that weakness followed long periods of hunger. Cold air itself does not cause illness, but cold weakens resistance. When the body spends energy simply staying warm, there is less strength left to fight infection. Crowded sleeping spaces made matters worse. Families huddled together for warmth. Breath mingled in close air. If one person began coughing at night, others often followed within days. The winter cough. A simple cough could become serious quickly. Smoke from indoor fires irritated lungs. Many poor homes lacked proper ventilation. Thick air filled small cottages. Children and elders suffered most. A cough that lingered too long might turn into something more severe. Pneumonia was common, though it had no name in the modern sense. It was simply described as a sickness of the chest. Symptoms were clear: heavy breathing, sharp pain, fever that burned despite freezing air outside. Without medicine as we know it today, recovery depended on strength, and strength depended on food and warmth, fevers in the night. Imagine lying beneath a wool cloak, your body shaking from chills, yet your forehead burning with heat. Fever in winter was deeply unsettling. It confused the senses. Sweat dampened clothing, and damp clothing meant danger. Wet fabric steals warmth rapidly. Families try to keep fevered bodies dry, changing cloth when possible, offering thin broth for hydration, praying quietly beside the hearth, because prayer was part of healing. Faith provided comfort where medicine could not. Herbal remedies. Though scientific medicine was limited, herbal knowledge existed. Certain plants were used for winter illness: willow bark for pain, honey to soothe throats, garlic believed to strengthen the body. Monasteries often kept herb gardens. In towns, some women were known for their knowledge of simple remedies. Warm infusions made from dried herbs offered comfort, if not cure. Steam from boiling water sometimes eased breathing. These treatments were gentle, and sometimes enough. The danger of malnutrition. Hunger weakened immunity. Thin bodies had less reserve. Children who entered winter already underfed were at greater risk. Elderly individuals who struggled to eat solid bread lost weight quickly. Malnutrition made recovery slower. Even minor infections became serious. Winter illness was rarely dramatic. It progressed slowly. A cough that lingered. Fatigue that deepened. Strength that did not fully return. And sometimes silence. Hospitals and care. As mentioned before, medieval hospitals were closer to shelters. They offered beds and basic care. Monks and nuns tended to the sick, changing straw bedding, offering broth, keeping fires lit when possible. These spaces were crowded in winter. Illness spread easily among patients, but being indoors near steady warmth improved chances. For the poorest, admission into such a place could mean survival. Community care. In villages, illness was rarely faced alone. Neighbours noticed absence. If someone failed to appear at the well, or did not open shutters at dawn, curiosity turned into concern. A knock at the door, a check beside the hearth. Care was informal, simple, human. Someone might bring extra bread, or sit quietly through the night, not as trained doctors, but as companions. Winter illness revealed the strength of community bonds. The psychological weight cold and darkness affect the mind. Long nights create stillness. Isolation grows heavier. Melancholy, though not named as depression, was felt, especially among those living alone. Silence can be comforting, but extended silence in freezing rooms becomes oppressive. Storytelling by the fire helped. Even in poor homes, legends, memories, small jokes. These moments warmed more than the hearth. They reminded people that winter was temporary, even if it felt endless. when recovery came. If illness passed, recovery was gradual. Strength returned slowly. Muscles weakened by weeks. Indoors needed movement. But movement meant stepping back into cold. So recovery often lagged behind spring. The first warm days felt miraculous. Sunlight on skin, air that did not sting. For those who survived illness, spring carried deep gratitude, not expressed loudly, but felt deeply. When illness did not pass, there were winters when sickness claimed lives, especially among infants and elders. Communities mourned quietly. Burials took place even in frozen ground, sometimes delayed until thaw. Grief in winter felt sharper, colder, yet life continued, because it had to. Fields would need planting, animals tending, children raising. Winter did not pause for sorrow. Take a slow breath in, and imagine the sound of morning in winter. Not birdsong, not busy footsteps in a marketplace, but a softer sound. Wind brushing against wooden shutters, a distant dog barking once, snow shifting gently from a rooftop. Winter did not only bring cold, it brought stillness. And for the poor in the Middle Ages, stillness meant something dangerous. It meant less work. When the fields fell silent, most rural labour followed the rhythm of the land. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest. But winter froze the soil. Fields hardened like stone. Ploughs rested. Hands that once worked from sunrise to dusk found fewer tasks. For landowners, this season was inconvenient. For labourers paid by the day, it was frightening. Because if you were paid only when you worked, and there was no work, there were no coins, small winter tasks. But winter was not entirely empty. There were always small jobs. Repairing fences damaged by autumn storms, mending tools inside barns, sharpening blades, caring for animals. Livestock required daily attention regardless of season. Water troughs froze and needed breaking. Stalls required cleaning. Hay needed distributing carefully. These tasks were slower, less frequent, and often reserved for those already tied to a farm. Casual labourers had fewer opportunities. Still, any small task was valuable. Even a few coins could mean bread. Firewood gathering. Firewood became precious in winter. Some villages allowed limited gathering of fallen branches. Men and older children ventured into nearby woods, axes over shoulders, breath visible in cold air, the ground crackling under frozen leaves. Gathering wood was tiring work. Carrying bundles back through snow required strength and sometimes permission. In lands controlled by nobles, cutting wood without approval could lead to fines. So people collected what they could legally take. Small branches, twigs, anything dry enough to burn. Wood meant warmth. Warmth meant survival. Spinning and weaving. For women especially, winter meant indoor labour. Spinning wool into thread. Weaving cloth when looms were available. These tasks continued year-round. But winter's long nights created more time for them. The rhythmic motion of spinning wheels, the soft pull of fibres between fingers, thread slowly building into something useful. Cloth created during winter might be sold in spring, or traded for food. It was patient work, quiet work, but it provided value, and value meant options. Urban winter labour. In towns and cities, winter slowed trade, but not completely. Blacksmiths continued their craft indoors. Cobblers repaired worn shoes, especially important during wet, cold months. Carpenters worked inside workshops when materials allowed. Markets operated less frequently, but they did not vanish. Urban poor often sought temporary jobs, carrying goods, clearing snow from entrances, hauling firewood for wealthier households. These jobs were inconsistent. But even one day's labour mattered. The role of guilds. In larger towns, skilled workers belonged to guilds. Guild members had more stability. Apprentices and journeymen often lived with masters, receiving food and shelter in exchange for work. This arrangement offered some protection from winter unemployment, but unskilled labourers lacked such security. They relied on chance, and chance in winter was unpredictable. Begging as survival. For some, winter work was not enough. Begging increased during harsh seasons, standing near church doors, near marketplaces, near bakeries, wrapped in thin cloaks, hands extended quietly. Medieval society did not view begging exactly as modern societies might. Poverty was visible everywhere, and charity was considered a religious duty. Some gave small coins, others bread crusts. Not everyone was generous, but begging was a recognised survival strategy, not prideful, not dramatic, simply necessary. Travelling for opportunity. Some poor workers moved between towns in search of work. Winter travel was difficult, roads icy, days short, but sometimes a nearby town might offer temporary employment, repairing city walls, clearing debris, assisting in storage houses. Travellers often carried little beyond their cloaks and tools, sleeping wherever shelter could be found. Movement was risk, but staying still without income was also risk, so choices were made carefully. Women's invisible labour. Much winter labour went unseen. Women patched clothing repeatedly, reinforced seams, stuffed cracks in walls with cloth scraps, cooked carefully measured meals, managed scarce supplies. Their work did not always bring coins directly, but it extended survival, stretching grain, preserving leftovers, keeping children warm. Winter required management, and management was work. Children's contribution. Children helped too, fetching water, even when wells were rimmed with ice, gathering small twigs near home, watching younger siblings while parents sought work. Medieval childhood was not sheltered from hardship, but it was not without warmth either. Children still played in snow, still laughed, even while carrying small responsibilities. Winter did not erase joy entirely. It simply made joy quieter. The sound of tools in winter. Imagine the sharp ring of hammer against metal inside a dim workshop, the scrape of knife sharpening on stone, the steady hum of a spinning wheel. These sounds carried through cold air, proof that life continued, that even in stillness, work persisted. Small tasks repeated day after day, each one adding a thread to the fragile fabric of survival. Coins and careful spending. When coins were earned, they were spent carefully. Bread first, then fuel, clothing repairs if absolutely necessary. Luxury did not exist at this level. Every purchase was weighed against remaining days of winter. How long until spring? How much grain remains? Can this coin stretch another week? Winter sharpened decision-making. It left no room for waste, not with gentle snowfall, but with thick, endless grey. So far we have walked through ordinary medieval winters. Cold, yes. Hungry, often. Difficult, always. But some winters were not ordinary. Some winters were remembered for years, spoken about long after spring returned, because sometimes winter did not simply arrive. It attacked. When snow did not stop. There were years when snow fell early, earlier than expected, before harvests were fully secured, fields still holding crops beneath sudden frost. In such years, food supplies began lower than planned. Then snow continued, day after day, covering roads, blocking trade routes between towns. Carts could not pass, markets grew quieter. Without trade, cities lost access to outside grain. Prices rose quickly. For the poor, rising prices were more dangerous than falling snow, because even when bread existed, it became unreachable. Rivers that froze solid. In especially cold years, rivers froze. Thick sheets of ice formed across moving water. For children, this might have seemed magical. For adults, it was alarming. Frozen rivers stopped transport. Boats carrying goods could not move. Fishing became impossible. Water access required breaking ice daily. In some towns, people crossed rivers on foot, but this was a sign of severity. Nature had shifted from cold to unforgiving. The Little Ice Age. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe experienced colder average temperatures. Modern historians call part of this period the Little Ice Age. Medieval people did not name it, but they felt it. Longer winters, shorter growing seasons, more frequent crop failures. For the poor, each failed harvest multiplied winter risk. One harsh winter might be endured. 2 in a row strained communities deeply. 3 could devastate them. Winter was no longer seasonal discomfort. It became a cycle of scarcity, blizzards, and isolation. Imagine wind so strong it erases tracks in moments. Snow driven sideways, visibility reduced to only a few steps ahead. Blizzards in medieval times trapped families indoors, doors blocked by drifts, roofs bearing heavy weight, travel between homes impossible for days. In rural villages, this meant isolation. If someone fell ill during such storms, help could not arrive. If food ran out, there was no quick solution. Communities learned to prepare for storms, but preparation had limits, and nature did not negotiate. When fuel ran out. In ordinary winters, wood supplies were stretched carefully. In extreme winters, they vanished. When firewood ran low, people burned alternatives, old furniture, broken tools, even sections of fencing, anything dry enough to create flame. The loss of wood meant more than cold. It meant dismantling parts of daily life, sacrificing long-term resources for short-term survival. A hard choice. But winter often demanded hard choices, hunger turning to famine. If winter followed a poor harvest, hunger deepened into famine. Famine was not dramatic at first, it was slow. Portions shrinking again, meals skipped, energy fading. Eventually entire communities weakened. Work stopped not because fields were frozen, but because bodies lacked strength. Historical records describe years when people travelled long distances seeking food. Some found help, some did not. But even during famine, small acts of sharing remained. A crust divided between siblings, a neighbour offering thin broth, hope shrinking, but not disappearing. The psychological weight of endless cold, harsh winters did not only weaken bodies, they weighed on minds. When grey skies lasted for weeks, when snow reflected pale light day after day, when warmth never quite returned to fingers, a quiet heaviness settled, conversation shortened, movement slowed, hope required effort. But people found small ways to endure mentally: prayer, song, storytelling, even humour, dark, simple humour, around small fires. Winter tested spirit as much as flesh. Survival through community. The harshest winters revealed something important. No one survived alone for long. Villages that cooperated fared better, sharing wood stores, pooling grain, rotating care for the sick. Cities with organised charity distributed resources more effectively. Even small gestures mattered. A family inviting a neighbour to sleep closer to their hearth. A baker reducing profits slightly to keep bread affordable. These decisions were not universal, but they existed, and they saved lives. The return of light. Even the harshest winter ends, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. One day the sun lingers slightly longer. Snow begins melting along roof edges. Water drips steadily into muddy streets. The air shifts from biting to damp. For those who endured brutal winters, spring felt miraculous, not joyful in a loud way, but relieving, deeply relieving. Survival itself became celebration, remembering the harsh years. Extreme winters were remembered. Parents told children about the year the river froze, about the winter of empty grain sacks. Memory became warning. Prepare early, store carefully, share wisely. because winter would return. It always did, and memory strengthened resilience. Take a slow breath in, and imagine a single candle glowing in a cold room. Outside, the night is long. Inside, the flame is small, but steady. Winter in the Middle Ages was not only a physical trial, it was a spiritual one. When food ran low, when illness lingered, when storms erased roads and darkened skies, people turned towards something deeper than warmth. They turned toward faith. The Church in winter. In medieval Europe, faith was woven into daily life. Church bells marked time, holy days shaped seasons, and in winter the church became more than a place of worship. It became shelter, not always physically, though sometimes it was that too, but emotionally, spiritually. A stone church, though cold, offered thick walls and a sense of protection. Candles flickered before simple altars. Voices echoed in hymn. Even in poverty, even in hunger, people gathered there. Because gathering meant connection, and connection softened winter's isolation. The meaning of winter in belief. Winter held symbolism. Darkness before light. Death before rebirth. Cold before warmth. The cycle of seasons mirrored spiritual teaching. Just as spring would return to frozen fields, hope would return to troubled hearts. This belief did not remove hunger. It did not erase frostbite, but it gave suffering meaning, and meaning can carry a person farther than comfort. Prayer beside the hearth. Not every prayer happened in church. Many happened quietly at home. A mother whispering over a sleeping child, a father crossing himself before extinguishing the fire, hands clasped in dim firelight, words soft and repetitive. Prayer was routine, steady. It created rhythm when winter disrupted everything else, and rhythm brings calm. Even today, repetition soothes the mind. In medieval cottages, prayer did the same. Feast days in the cold winter contained holy days that brightened the season. Christmas, most famously. Even the poor marked it in some way. A slightly better meal if possible. A shared moment of gratitude. Candles lit intentionally. The symbolism of light in darkness was powerful, even if bread was thin, even if cloaks were worn. On feast days, there was pause, a reminder that winter did not own the entire year. Joy still existed, quietly. Monasteries and charity religious houses played a role beyond ritual. Monasteries often distributed alms more generously in winter. Soup kitchens in simple form, bread lines forming in courtyards, monks copying manuscripts inside warm rooms may seem distant from poverty, but many also laboured in fields and kitchens. Faith, in its ideal form, demanded care for the poor. Not all institutions met this ideal perfectly, but many tried, and for a freezing labourer, even a bowl of thin broth offered by a monastery felt sacred. Pilgrims in winter. Though most pilgrimage travel happened in warmer seasons, some travellers still moved in winter, seeking healing, seeking forgiveness, seeking purpose. Pilgrimage was not easy, but it provided direction, a reason to endure cold roads, a belief that suffering had meaning, and sometimes, along pilgrimage routes, charitable hostels offered beds. Faith created networks of support across regions, invisible threads connecting strangers, fear and superstition. Winter darkness also stirred fear. Long nights fed imagination. Stories of spirits walking snowy fields, of wolves circling villages, of illness sent by unseen forces. Without scientific explanation, people interpreted hardship through spiritual lenses. Some believed extreme winters were punishment, others saw them as tests, still others simply accepted them as part of God's will. Belief shaped emotional response. It could comfort, but it could also frighten, and communities balanced both. Candles against the dark light mattered deeply in winter. Candles were expensive. Made from tallow or beeswax, the poor used them sparingly, but during prayer or special evenings, one might be lit intentionally. A single flame in a dark room transforms space. It creates focus, warmth, calm. Medieval families understood this instinctively. Light was hope made visible. Storytelling as spiritual strength faith was not only ritual, it was story. Biblical tales shared aloud, saints who endured hardship, miracles remembered. Stories passed between generations reminded listeners that suffering had been faced before, that endurance was possible, even heroic. Children listening beside the hearth absorbed these lessons quietly. Winter became classroom, faith became inheritance, hope as survival. Hope does not eliminate cold, it does not refill empty grain sacks, but it sustains effort. If spring will come, then endure one more night. If light follows darkness, then keep the fire alive until morning. Hope allowed medieval people to look beyond present discomfort, to imagine green fields beneath snow, to believe in warmth unseen, and belief-shaped behaviour. Those who believed spring would return were more likely to prepare for it, to plan, to save, to endure. The sound of bells in frosted air. Imagine standing in a snowy village at dawn, frost sparkling on rooftops, the sky pale and quiet. Then, in the distance, a church bell rings, slow, clear, carried through cold air. The sound cuts through isolation. It reminds everyone they are not alone. Others wake too, others endure too. Winter binds communities together through shared experience. Faith gives language to that bond. Take a slow breath in and imagine something subtle changing. Not warmth yet, not comfort, just a shift. The kind you almost miss after months of cold stone floors, of tight-wrapped cloaks, of thin broth and careful firewood. Winter does not end all at once. It loosens, slowly, quietly, and medieval people watched carefully for the first signs, the first drop of meltwater. It might begin with a sound, a soft drip, water falling from the edge of a thatched roof, snow once solid and unmoving beginning to soften. Children noticed it first. They stepped into streets where slush replaced hard frost, boots sinking slightly, breath still visible in the air but lighter. For adults, that first drip meant calculation. Is it early thaw, or a brief pause before more snow? Experience had taught caution. Winter sometimes teased, but hope stirred anyway. Longer evenings. Daylight stretched gently, not dramatically, just minutes at a time. But those minutes mattered. More light meant more opportunity for work, more time to mend tools outside, more visibility in workshops. Sunlight through a small window could warm a room slightly, even if only by a fraction. The psychological effect was powerful. Light carries promise, and promise carries strength. The condition of the stores. By late winter, food stores were fragile. Grain sacks nearly empty, root vegetables softening, salted meat long consumed. If thaw came early, relief spread quickly. If frost lingered into March, anxiety deepened. This period, just before spring planting, was the most delicate. Bodies were thin, fuel low, strength worn. Yet work would soon be required again. Fields needed preparing. Animals needed tending more actively. Survival had shifted from endurance to preparation. The smell of damp earth. When snow melts, earth awakens. The scent rises, dark and rich. After months of cold air and smoke-filled rooms, that scent felt almost shocking. Alive. Farmers walked fields cautiously, testing soil with boots. Too wet and planting must wait. Too frozen beneath the surface and seeds would fail. Timing mattered deeply, because one failed planting could echo into the next winter. Repairs. After the cold winter left damage behind, fences broken under snow weight, roofs weakened, tools rusted from damp air. Spring did not begin gently. It began with repair. Labourers who had struggled to find work during winter now found tasks waiting. Wood needed cutting, stone needed resetting, fields needed clearing. Work returned, and with it, small coins, not abundance, but motion. And motion meant progress. Animals stirring livestock, confined tightly during harsh months, grew restless. Chickens laid fewer eggs in deep winter. Cows produced less milk. As days lengthened, productivity slowly returned. Milk increased. Eggs appeared more often. These were small signs, but deeply encouraging ones. Food variety improved, even slightly. And children felt the change first. A fresh egg after months of thin meals tasted like celebration. Markets reopening. Fully. As roads softened, trade resumed. Carts creaked into towns once more. Merchants carrying grain, cloth, dried fish. Prices slowly stabilised. Urban poor who had struggled through high winter costs found slight relief. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Market sounds grew louder. Conversations returned to open squares. Winter silence retreated. The body after winter survival leaves marks. Hands rougher, faces thinner, movements slower at first. Spring required effort from bodies that had conserved energy for months. But the human body adapts. Gradually strength returned with better nutrition and longer days. Colour returned to cheeks. Children ran faster. Elders sat longer in sunlight. Winter had taken much. But it had not taken everything. The emotional release. There is a quiet moment in every harsh season, when you realise you have made it, not because snow is fully gone, not because fields are green, but because the worst has passed. For medieval families that realisation came softly, standing outside without shivering quite as hard, sleeping without waking from cold, cooking without worrying the last grain was gone. Relief is rarely loud. It is a deep exhale, memory of the cold. Even as warmth returned, memory lingered. The nights of near-empty bowls, the storms that rattled doors, the cough that lasted too long, these memories shaped behaviour. More wood stored next autumn, more grain saved if possible. Winter taught harsh lessons, and those who survived carried them forward. Experience became preparation. Preparation became resilience. Children and spring children embraced thaw fully. Snow melting into mud meant play. Sticks became swords. Puddles became rivers. Laughter replaced long indoor stillness. For them, winter faded faster. For adults, it lingered longer in thought. But seeing children run freely again reminded parents why they endured, why they rationed food carefully, why they shared warmth, why they sacrificed. Spring justified winter's struggle. Take one slow, gentle breath in, and let it go. Winter is almost behind us now. The snow has thinned along the roads. The river moves again beneath fragile sheets of ice. Smoke rises more steadily from chimneys, not in desperation, but in routine. We have walked through hunger, through cold floors and thin blankets, through coughs in the night and empty grain sacks, through storms that buried doors and silence that lasted too long. And now, in this final chapter, we pause. Because surviving winter in the Middle Ages was not only about techniques, it was about something quieter, something steady, something deeply human. Survival was never dramatic. When we imagine history, we often picture battles, kings, castles, armies marching across frozen land. But the real story of winter belonged to ordinary people. A mother stretching flour to last 3 more days, a father waking in the night to check the embers, a child giving up the warmest place near the hearth to a younger sibling. Survival was not heroic in appearance. It was repetitive, daily, quiet, and yet it required remarkable strength. Endurance as a way of life. Winter returned every year. It was not a surprise, it was expected, and that expectation shaped medieval life completely. People did not ask, Will winter come? They asked. Are we ready? Preparation became culture, saving small scraps of cloth, stacking wood higher than felt necessary, drying beans carefully in autumn sun, repairing roofs before frost arrived. The poor had little margin for error, but they had memory, and memory created wisdom. Community over isolation. One of the clearest truths of medieval winter is this: no one survived alone for long. The poorest were vulnerable, the elderly especially so. But villages watched one another. Cities developed systems of charity. Families combined resources. Even strangers sometimes extended small kindness, because everyone understood the same reality. Cold does not discriminate. Winter can humble anyone, and shared survival strengthened bonds that summer never could. The value of small comforts. Comfort was never extravagant. It was small. A slightly thicker bowl of stew, a borrowed blanket, a candle lit on a feast day, a story told beside the fire. These small comforts did not erase hardship, but they made hardship bearable. In a world without electric light, central heating or instant supply chains, warmth was fragile. And because it was fragile, it was cherished. What winter revealed. Winter revealed the limits of the body. It revealed the importance of food. It revealed how quickly hunger weakens strength. But it also revealed resilience. People adapted constantly, stuffing straw into shoes, sleeping closer together, stretching broth thinner but sharing it anyway. Human beings are remarkably inventive when faced with necessity. Medieval winters were classrooms of survival, the children who grew through it. Children raised in such winters learned early lessons. They learned patience. They learned thrift. They learned that warmth must be protected. They grew into adults who prepared carefully, who remembered the year the snow did not stop, who told their own children stories of endurance. Winter shaped generations, not through trauma alone, but through repetition of resilience. The rhythm of the year, perhaps the most powerful truth is this: winter always ended. Not quickly, not easily, but reliably. After frost, thaw. After darkness, longer days. After hunger, planting. This rhythm created quiet hope. Even in the hardest weeks, when stores ran low and coughs lingered, somewhere beneath frozen soil, seeds waited. Medieval people lived closely enough to nature to trust this cycle, and trust is powerful. A different kind of wealth. The poor of the Middle Ages did not possess abundance. They lacked comfort by modern standards. But they possessed something else: adaptability, community, faith, memory. They understood the value of heat because they had felt deep cold. They understood the value of bread because they had known hunger. Winter sharpened appreciation. It made simple things sacred. Looking back from warm rooms, tonight as you listen from a warm space, perhaps beneath a soft blanket, with steady light around you, it is easy to forget how fragile warmth once was, how carefully each ember had to be protected, how precious each loaf of bread felt in late February. The poor of medieval times did not survive because life was easy. They survived because they adjusted, because they shared, because they endured without expecting comfort. The quiet heroism of ordinary lives. History remembers kings and wars, but survival stories like these belong to unnamed people. The labourer who gathered wood before dawn, the widow who saved half her crust for tomorrow, the child who carried water through snow without complaint. Their names are not recorded, but their endurance built the world that followed. Winter after winter they endured, and that endurance deserves remembering. Take one final slow breath. Imagine a small medieval village at the end of winter, mud replacing snow along the roads, smoke rising steadily from chimneys, children stepping carefully into damp fields. The cold has not vanished entirely, but it has loosened its grip. The poorest among them have made it through, not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. and that was always the goal. To reach spring, to see another sunrise, to feel the earth soften beneath their feet once more. Thank you for walking through this long winter night. Now, let your thoughts grow quiet, let your breathing slow, and let yourself drift into rest, grateful for warmth, for shelter, and for the quiet strength that carries us through every season. Good night.